Stephen Foster on the occasion of the exhibition Dark Places, and I'm joined today by four of the artists, Neil White, Steve Rowell, Steve Beard and Victoria Halford. Neil, first of all, this exhibition emerged from a collaboration of a number of curatorial partners, but in many ways you were central to this, so I wonder if you'd give us some idea of how the exhibition came together.
It originated not solely from me, but through conversations with Arts Catalyst and Helen Sloan, who worked together on a series of commissions around concepts of dark places. And Office of Experiments, which I initiated, was very interested in doing something which was perhaps looking at the whole concept of dark places, a kind of broader UK view. And it seemed that there were so many artists involved in so many different places in different ways that it seemed there was a lot of rich content to kind of look at.
So you were in this exhibition both on your own as an artist and as a partnership as well. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about the relationship between the work that you've done with Steve and the Office of Experiments.
Yeah, the room that we're sitting in now is the Office of Experiments project. This is the Overt Research project, and Office of Experiments works as a collaborative body. So this project was developed with Steve Rowell, myself, somebody called Lisa Haskell, and a few other researchers with the support of Arts Catalyst. And Steve and I have been working on field research for some time, and what you're seeing here in this room is the not the culmination of that, but a stage in that. So we have the South edition of the Overt Research, looking into dark places, sites of interest, sites of spaces of secrecy. And the process will continue. This is why this structure you see behind us is there, because it represents the site office, the research office of a live project that's still going. So you can get information inside, but there's also a slideshow.
So how will people react with this?
It depends on the degree that they want to go into it. It's a bit like the sites themselves, that they may well be passers-by of many of these sites, like they pass by so many things. And one of the things that is really evident that we found during our field research was that a public secret is a very good way of disguising or concealing something that's maybe a little bit more, not necessarily sinister, but more undisclosed. People might recognise some of these sites. Some of them are well known, some of them are less well known, but are in fairly kind of good thoroughfares. So they may have seen these sites, but they might not have an inkling of what's going on. So we're not unpacking everything, giving all the information about what's going on, but we're looking at these sites as they sit in that landscape and as spaces of research, intelligence, technology, that we all know that there's something happening in there, but we're not quite sure what it is.
And the Office of Experiments is a research group that specifically is looking at sites that are not easily disclosed in terms of their function.
Office of Experiments does multiple projects simultaneously.
Secrecy,
yeah, so this is the Overt Research project, is just one of three that we're currently doing. So during the course of the research, we of course looked at many sites and deciding which ones we were going to look at in detail. So there's background research and then there's field visits. And one of the sites was Porton Down in Salisbury, in Wiltshire, which does a lot of, and for many years has been kind of quite notorious for its biochemical warfare research and controversial. So in doing research about that and how to best approach it, I came across that linked with somebody on the internet originally called Ice Whale, which will explain the image in that room, which turned out to be a guy called Mike Kenner, who turned out to being a researcher, really a single issue campaigner who for about 30 years has been extremely concerned and has been monitoring the activities of Porton Down. He lives in Weymouth, and what's interesting, when I went to meet him, what I discovered was, and some of the material in that archive that you'll see, relates to the experiments carried out by Porton Down from the 50s up until fairly recently, and as far as we know, ongoing. But particularly to do with public spraying, which was maybe not so wide known, which was a ship called the Ice Whale went across Lyme Bay in particular, this is one of the famous experiments, and sprayed a combination of zinc cadmium sulfide with an agent called BG, and that was just left to drift across Weymouth and then was monitored. So it was sprayed onto the public, and Porton Down have gone on to do lots of public spraying experiments. And this is the aim of Mike's kind of work, is to uncover that research. So I found it fascinating, and he started getting all these files out and freedom of information stuff. But what was really interesting was if you ring up Porton Down and request difficult information from them, they give Mike Kenner's phone number now. So they've kind of co-opted him and sort of
because he's quite
him.
specifically revealed information through Freedom of Information Act,
and
which
he
is
has,
a specialist.
Yeah, he's a specialist. And it was that really difficult relationship between some of these spaces of science and technology and the work that you can do around them that was so interesting, because he kind of walks that line that probably all of us have to think about when we walk,
absolutely.
Which is the degree to which you are involved with these spaces as an artist, and the degree which you maintain a critical distance.
Of course, this exhibition is curatorially kind of an interesting one, because it's got a number of curatorial partners, which was an interesting exercise, as you say. SCAN and Arts Catalyst have been involved, Arts Catalyst being a founder of the project in the sense. But there is also a mixture of commissioned work and new work made towards the project and existing work. So, Steve and Victoria, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your project, and especially the H&S lab in the Peak District, which your piece is based upon.
We're primarily interested in accidents and the nature of the accident, particularly the industrial accident. So in that sense, that for us is the real dark place. That's what Paul Virilio calls an unknown quantity. I mean, when an accident occurs, when, for example, there's a fire on the London Underground at King's Cross Station, as there was some 20 years ago, or when there's a train derailment, as happened at Potter's Bar, this is, in a way, symptomatic of the appearance of a kind of political unconscious. These terrible events are the manifest content of the accident, but there's a kind of a latent content waiting to be retrieved. The Health and Safety Laboratory, which is located on a remote conical hill in a relatively inaccessible part of the Peak District, is where many of these kinds of large-scale accidents, often sadly involving many deaths, are investigated. And so we wanted to go there because we wanted to see how science investigated these accidents, while at the same time wanting to maintain a perspective on their activities which was expressing a kind of an imaginative solidarity with those people who may have been killed in accidents. So there was that similar sort of double consciousness that I think Neil was talking about. And then Victoria was able to get us into the lab. And what was actually quite interesting in terms of this being an inaccessible place was that they were actually welcoming and willing to expose to a certain extent what went on there.
So what do you think, well, they weren't prepared to reveal?
We went on a little tour throughout the grounds and throughout most of the buildings, and there's a huge amount of space there. There's lots of different departments and lots of areas that were, they laid open to us. And they do all manner of things. They make models, they make life-size models and to-scale models. They have a massive archive there, film archive, photo archive as well. So during conversations, they frequently sort of referred to ongoing legal matters and legal cases that they sort of had interesting anecdotes about, but would then sort of say, oh, you can't talk about that. So there was, I think that was quite a sort of a certain level of trust there. It
strikes me that when one of these terrible tragedies occurs, very often the inquest afterwards reveals that certain safety measures can be introduced which simply aren't financially viable. And this is a very controversial thing. Has this come into your investigations at all?
That the mechanical engineers at the Health and Safety Laboratory are primarily focused upon reconstructing an accident in order to solve quite a narrow technical task. So in that sense, the latent content of a fire on the London Underground is a dropped cigarette. That's the cause. But what's interesting about these investigations is that they open up a space within which it's possible for other questions to be asked.
And of course the solution to the King's Cross incident is simple: ban smoking, whereas having different kinds of warning lights on railway lines can cost billions.
So there's a sense in which what's really revealed around that is an implied or hidden, to an extent, social contract which specifies that a certain number of accident victims are socially acceptable in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. I think that's what's interesting, is to actually have those kinds of socio-economic calculations revealed, because these are calculations that are not necessarily the responsibility of 5 people in a smoke-filled room. They come out of policy-making committee meetings, the implied consent of a population that's not too interested in these matters. But I think that the particular specific activities of the accident investigators at the Health and Safety Laboratory manages to focus attention on these kinds of inframings that allow us to understand that what's really being revealed by the accident and the investigation into the accident is the reality of the social body.
So your film piece, Voodoo Science Park, is it a documentary film or is it a
Well,
piece
no,
of
it's a narrative, and in some senses it's a split between the HSL residency, the HSL work that we did, and the film. They are in some senses separate, because the film is it's an imaginary sort of poetic response to our time up there. I mean, even though we undertook interviews and took photographs and we spent lots of time in the archive and everything else, a relatively small amount of the actual raw data, so to speak, or the field work is actually in the film. So the film was really in response to our time.
It got condensed down into a story, effectively, so a lot of these insights. So we became interested in a lot of the safety rigs that are actually there in the square mile grounds surrounding the main laboratory, which were initially used to simulate the kinds of mining accidents that might occur, but now used to simulate the kinds of civil train disasters that have sadly occurred in the last few years. So we felt that these kinds of sort of engines in the grounds were in some ways visible instruments of this sort of implied social contract that I was mentioning earlier, and they sort of resonated with the history of the surrounding Peak District in terms of the kinds of state apparatuses that might have been in place on the top of a conical hill in terms of gallows and so on. So there was a sense in which maybe these sorts of engines of state power, which had previously been quite visible and designed to produce spectacles of terror, had in a way been pulled into this sort of semi-museum space where they were still used, but nevertheless there was a statutory responsibility to maintain them, but they were not used as often as much of the scientific activity in the laboratory, which would have been increasingly up now about computer simulation of accidents. So to that extent they were for us something quite material, something quite architectonic, something that we sort of responded to and in an embodied fashion, which we wanted to capture and make sort of resonate with the landscape in order to produce a film which was sort of really meditating upon the reality of this sort of social contract.
We're having a kind of whistle-stop tour around the exhibition here, so before some of the issues I want to discuss come up, but Steve, I wonder if you could just talk through the other piece that you have in the exhibition here.
Sure. It's a portion of a much larger project called the Ultimate High Ground. In this case, it's the Ultimate High Ground UK, and it refers to a project I began about 2 years ago, sort of looking at, broadly speaking, this kind of looking at the extent of the U.S. So as I moved away from America 2 years ago to Europe, I thought it would be a useful thing to do, is sort of like, take a look at America's sort of footprint abroad, as it were, which of course is quite large. And thinking about maybe this moment being an apogee of that, as bases are actually closing.
Why do you think of it in that way?
Because
for financial? Or?
Financial reasons, definitely. The Department of Defense budget seems to probably, be on its top level, perhaps at this point in time. Just this week alone, President Obama has been in China and Japan, and Japan, he was talking about closing a base as one of the ideas of closing a much contested base in Okinawa. So. But of course, this subject is quite large, and one person can only do so much. So I decided to focus on one aspect of it, looking at sites of communication, and sort of like looking at the metaphor behind that. There's two primary ones here in the UK. One of them is Menwith Hill in North Yorkshire near Harrogate. That's the largest of its type outside of the U.S. It's a spy base, basically, and how people look at it, but it's also much more than that, and probably not as sinister as people like to think of it, but it has a huge aura of secrecy around it, mostly for good reason, I think, because it does represent an incredible amount of information that's being funneled through this site and then being sort of dispersed into the ether to satellites around the globe. So it is possibly one of the most connected places on the planet. And then RAF Fylingdales, which is a radar facility, is in a way sort of its protector. It's basically looking at satellites and objects as large as your fist, basically, or as small as your fist, and looking at these objects, tracking them, and sort of cataloging them, thinking about how these objects may or may not eventually interact with satellites, causing them to smash into one another and bring the whole system crashing down in a way. So the two do work together hand in hand in many ways. And the project is basically a sort of a photographic project, but there is a video element to it in this room that I've sort of constructed. That's looking at the four corners of Menwith Hill, but looking away from the base in a way to have a sidelong glance at this place that you can't really know much about. And it's very much about knowledge, And it's a place that is so completely all-knowing. I mean, if there's a place that might be completely omniscient, then I think Menwith Hill might be it, because it's connected to agencies in the U.S. that are, dedicated to finding out everything they can about the rest of the world. So it really is sort of a panoptic view of the planet, and this is the sort of technological node on the landscape that I'm looking at, but sort of remotely in a way, not actually trying to reveal anything.
Something I'd like to ask both of you, really, in a sense, is that you have an interesting way of working. All your work is research-based, but it can be as part of one grouping or another grouping, with the Office of Experiments and CLUI and so on. How do you feel about working in that way? I mean, in terms of your own identity?
It was a little tricky, because in this case I am myself. I'm actually, playing Steve Rowell, which is unusual, and I've been doing that for the last few years more often. But it's tricky, actually, because I've been working with the Center for quite some time, and I'm working as part of this other organization here in this show, and it's a juggling act, basically. That's how I look at it. And in terms of how the work is exhibited, I think that's how my work differs very much from the Center, because I think that the way I've sort of learned to work in the field is very much based upon what I've known for the past 8 years. And I think that's what I brought a bit to the OOE is field work, methodology, photography, out on the landscape.
It's not incidental that your way of working is research-based, really.
I think that's kind of one of the underlying kind of metaphors or questions within the whole exhibition, is this idea of how things are represented, particularly the ways in which knowledge is represented, and those instruments by which it's represented, i.e. those institutions or sites, and how you come to intervene with those is often, as an artist, there is a sort of power relationship, and it's, we have the power, we will offer you some sort of access, and therefore, as is often the case with the funding, you will perform some action like public engagement. And I think one of the things that's interesting about all of the artists, and Vitruvius as well, is that there's this implied critique of the way in which those instruments of power function. To say, it's not just a straightforward political protest, but it's to say, wait a minute, let's just think about how those things happen, how we see those things, how those things are represented to us. And part of the way of working in sort of a semi-institutional way, as Centre for Land Use, Office of Experiments, is to create counter-institutions that take their own responsibility. I mean, in a way, that's why the Mike Kenner Archive is seen as being the first of a collection of autonomous researcher collection. So this idea of bringing into one place archives of people who would never enter into institutions because, they've been irritants, or they've been, but in themselves they've been, they've shown amazingly interesting insights or made something visible that wouldn't be visible in any other way.
It's a good time to mention the other artist in the exhibition is an installation by Beatrice da Costa, Memorial to the Still Living, which gives examples which have been taken from the Natural History Museum and the Horniman Museum of indigenous plants and animals that are threatened with extinction for one or another reason. And that, in many ways, because your work, you four, if you like, have work that relates to exploring and investigating the landscape in some form or another and what is revealed by it, it seems to be a rather different piece of work in a sense to the others.
Well, Beatrice was very interested in working with the Natural History Museum, an institution in itself that has spent a long time and represents a certain body of knowledge, and I think she's in a way revealing some of the aspects that are hidden maybe from everyday view, and this idea of knowledge of what might soon become extinct in some way is not immediately apparent as you travel around the landscape. I mean, in just a very simple way.
This exhibition was built upon the idea of exploring the relationship between science, research and technology. But in fact, it could look as if it's about conspiracy and paranoia. But you've been quite careful to not emphasise that side of things. And it occurred to me, I wondered whether it's possible that one of the problems we confront today is that the world of science and research is so advanced that the average layperson really can't understand it. So it's quite possible that many things are less overt than one might imagine, simply because they are less communicable to a layperson. Is that a fair comment?
At HSL, a lot of the field specialisms are tremendously specialised. There's field engineering, there's mechanical engineering, explosives and everything else. But if you talk to people about the actual work they do, the investigation into Hillsborough, everybody knows what that was about. And okay, there's a guy that measures how much pressure can go on a steel bar before it buckles. But everybody knows what it means in real life, and everybody knows what Potter's bar means because it's affected all of our lives, even if you hardly ever use a train. So the pure science may not be something that people can really understand. But one of the appeals for us to go to HSL is that it's stuff that absolutely everybody gets, really, when you talk about it in those terms.
So in that sense, it's the difference between pure science and applied science. So for us, the science that we were investigating was actually quite an old science. It's the science of classical mechanics. It's Newton, the three laws of motion. And we were interested in how this science of mechanics, once it becomes applied, then actually it's something different. It becomes mechanical engineering. As a discipline, this is actually about how the environment is built, and that's like the environment that we all live in, and it's not simply the urban environment, it's also the rural environment. So the fact that our film includes much footage of the Peak District landscape, we're attempting to indicate that this is a socially manufactured landscape. So in that sense, the connections between science as a pure science, science as an applied science, the environment, I think there's a sense in which, depending upon your way into thinking about science, you sort of get a different result in a way.
There is a sense in which there is an imaginary happening within this work that's going on, whilst everybody is plotting out and looking at and scrutinising these sites. It casts a shadow. The darkness is the shadow is what you don't know, and that's the space in which the imagination becomes very fertile. And we become quite paranoid. And you do.
Or imaginative.
Yeah, and imaginative. It's one of the two things. And I mean, I think when you look at contemporary society, and there's a strong fascination in conspiracy theory. But you look at contemporary politics and you think of something very controversial, Al Qaeda, for example, their network. How it's not a single site of power which one can see. It's a hidden, concealed kind of political resistance or whatever, ideological resistance that's dispersed. And there is only one way, or it's only considered one way of revealing that, which is they use technology, communications, but this is being countered by the same technology on the other side. And so, as a layperson looking at that, you're kind of left with these very thin representations of networks and threads and media spectacle. And you're filling in so much of what is actually there. And so when it comes to science, it's not exactly the same thing, but you have similar things happening. Yes, well, the layperson knows it up to a point and they understand applied areas, but there's so much of it they don't know about that they will just project into. And I think, I've been working in and around science for some time, and I think this is something that science has yet to get to grips with, that science is possibly also what people perceive of it as well as what it is.
Well, so here we are in the middle of the University of Southampton, which is full of scientists who are, or it's full of researchers of all sorts, and it's a very highly technological-based university. And there's a great deal of pressure on all researchers on the word impact, on the ability of researchers to explain more clearly to the public the impact of the work that they're doing. Now, if the two things we've discussed are put together, on the one hand, much of the work they're doing is beyond the comprehension of most ordinary people and therefore is very difficult to communicate, and on the other hand, there may be entirely benign. I mean, as you say, the pure research into health and safety is benign at the beginning, isn't it? It's genuinely trying to find out. It's the interpretation of that information that might become a little clogged. It's a very great challenge for our universities in making the work that they're doing more accessible, don't you think?
I think that there is, on the one hand, the challenge of how do we make complex social systems, whether they're collections of scientists distributed around the world or collections of terror cells, how do we actually make them signify, how do we actually build representations that are meaningful? It may well be that an artist or a cultural practitioner actually has to stimulate a certain amount of paranoia imaginatively in order that they can construct what we wanted to do, which was a narrative about these places. And a narrative is something that the public is used to sort of grappling with as a means of understanding complex subjects. So it may be that there's a sort of larger irony at work to an extent, because if this paranoia is simply an imaginative tool, perhaps it has actually less sort of social and political purchase on its material than it might think in its wilder moments. So that, for example, the Mike Kenner archive becomes the unofficial archive which Porton Down actually pushes the public to when they want to find out more about what's going on. So there's a sense in which actually, as an artist, you may think that you're an outsider. You may think that, in our case, once the implied social contract had been revealed at HSL, that they are making decisions on your behalf without you being informed or without your consent being offered about how many people it's acceptable to die in a train crash from our perspective, or you can think about how that can signify in other areas. Sure. But actually it's a question of, well, how much responsibility do you actually want to take for this yourself? And to say that you're part of these equations that are being put together, and actually can the representations that artists are putting together for the benefit of the public actually help those discussions to take place in a way that's a bit more meaningful?
Well, this exhibition has revealed two things as far as I'm concerned. An interesting way of working which you share, and your research-based activity has revealed lots of other things which are absolutely fascinating. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.